Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. Chinese technology has been one of the themes of this year after the sudden emergence of the Chinese company DeepSeek's generative AI model back in January caught many observers by surprise. But the US government's continuing efforts to limit the sale of the latest AI chips from companies like Nvidia to China is a reminder of the tensions that surround this area. The recently announced deal for a partial US takeover of Chinese social media platform TikTok's American operation may point to the potential for cooperation. But Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang has warned that restrictions on chip production will only encourage the development of China's own semiconductor industry, and he said recently that China was just a nanosecond behind in AI. But to what extent is Chinese innovation handicapped by political controls? And as China seeks to promote fields including robotics and cloud computing, can it avoid the type of overcapacity already seen in its electric vehicle industry? Well, to discuss these issues, we're joined from Beijing by Duncan Clark, one of the most experienced observers of China's technology scene. He founded the investment advisory company BDA in Beijing in 1994, giving him a ringside seat as telecommunications, the internet and new technology transformed the country. An early advisor to Jack Ma, founder of the e-commerce giant Alibaba, he's also author of the book Alibaba, the House That Jack Ma Built, and is currently also co-chair of the French branch of the Asia Society. So Duncan, thanks for joining us. How would you describe the mood in China's tech sector at the moment? Is it one of excitement at new opportunities, or are people still concerned about the practical challenges they face?
All of the above. I mean, I think, obviously the impact of technology is causing, more than ripples around the world. It's affecting people's jobs and livelihoods, the way we live, even our very power supply, right? I mean, some projections are that, there won't be enough power for all these AI, factories effectively. So, the same universal concerns and aspirations are true in China as well. I would say one thing, though. I think there is generally a more pro-technology stance to people in China, perhaps even in Asia, than certainly in Europe, where there's, sort of a culture of being technophobic. It's sort of, the newfangled is not necessarily the best thing. Of course, this goes back to the Industrial Revolution as well. I mean, there's this, Luddite trend. But I think because the last 30 years, and I've been here 31, I've had a home in Beijing since 94, technology has coincided, at least, probably caused, a lot of the improvements in people's lives. And so people probably here have a more positive outlook on that. And importantly, and Dan Wong in his book Breakneck, he makes a very powerful point that engineers run China and lawyers run the United States. And so there's a natural predisposition, if you will, from government and governance towards embracing technology as a form of solutions, as opposed to something scary or something that needs to be legislated and restricted.
Well, we saw earlier this year that Xi Jinping met with lots of technology entrepreneurs, including Jack Ma, who you know well from Alibaba, who had definitely been something of a persona non grata in the previous years. Are we seeing in real terms that kind of push to encourage entrepreneurship? Is having effects in China at the moment, would you say? And are these people now finding it easier to get access to funding?
Yes, on the one hand, we could say there had been a deficit of entrepreneurship in the wake of not only the crackdown from October 2020 on Jack Ma's financial empire, Ant Group, and also a range of companies, including Tencent and JD, and also training companies and the private sector writ large. There was a sense in late 2020 that the private sector entrepreneurs were getting too big for their boots, and impinging on vested interests. In the case of Ant, it was scarily big for the banks or the insurance companies or the securities companies, all of whom, are predominantly state-owned enterprises. So
Because Ant, which was Alibaba's financial arm, was doing all this lending.
yes, they were lending. I mean, very effectively, sourcing capital, distributing capital, highlighting an interesting point that there's a lot of financial repression in China, that the big state banks get, deposits that they pay low amounts on, and they, lend out state-owned enterprises. And, that has had other consequences, which we see of overbuilding of things, But so on the one hand, the low ebb probably came beginning in late 2020 through, of course, zero COVID, which was more really in 2022, but also the backdrop of this terrible, perhaps necessary popping of the property bubble in China, where we'd see massively over leveraged developers and so on. So it was this sort of triple or trifecta, as the Americans like to say, of property crackdown, private sector slash entrepreneur curbs, and also zero COVID, basically. But that's important to mention because it obviously disrupted a lot of businesses, a lot of small businesses. And of course, most entrepreneurship is happening amongst small and medium-sized enterprises. And so the low ebb, I think, came with what we've seen, the reduction in consumption. Of course, people who are feeling poorer because their property values going down, and importantly, their mortgage payments, are still there, right? Or just general sense of malaise. We've seen youth unemployment. So on the one hand, you could say there was, a deficiency of private sector investment or even entrepreneurial animal spirits. One could argue also that one of the challenges in China is that there are too many entrepreneurs today, because when you meet compelling entrepreneurs with a great product in China, increasingly I find that they're saying, well, we really want to export this into Europe, into Japan. There's just so many entrepreneurs in China. The competition is so intense that any good idea that emerges or a good product, within about 2, 3 seconds, there's like five other companies doing it, So China both has had a deficit of entrepreneurial spirit the last few years. And now I feel almost that the excess of competition is driving them to find markets overseas as an escape. Was previously foreign markets for most Chinese companies, say 5, 10 years ago, weren't big enough to really bother with. I mean, the vibrant Chinese internet economy, certainly in the 2010s and so on, was so great that they didn't bother really having businesses overseas. Maybe some small presence like Alibaba or JD or some other companies had overseas businesses. Now, of course, it's changed. I mean, in fact, some of the businesses that they set up overseas, famously like TikTok, it originated in an overseas business, not within China, actually. And so that's become obviously a massive factor. So overseas markets can be very interesting for Chinese, maybe not even for scale, but maybe for margin or some protection from each other.
But you're implying that despite all of those problems and a less positive mood towards the private sector and entrepreneurship over these previous few years, that it hasn't sort of dimmed the enthusiasm of I guess, young people in particular to start new things despite all of that.
Well, I think we have to be careful not to say that every young person is full of optimism and hope for the future when there's very high rates of unemployment, which, by the way, AI may be playing a role in as well as it is in the West, right? So again, that's playing out in China too. But I think you mentioned the DeepSeek moment, which came just days before the Chinese New Year in 2025, was well timed in the sense that it did actually lift spirits because it felt almost, frankly, almost felt like Europe, where Europe is sort of desperately now feeling a bit left behind by the sort of G2 competition of US and China in AI. China itself, before DeepSeek, was a bit, feeling very dependent, obviously, on the chips, from NVIDIA and many other pieces of equipment to make things that make things. And
from American
from
suppliers.
American, exactly, with the all these restrictions being put on companies from Huawei to SMIC. So just before Chinese New Year, the fact that a Chinese company was seen to have cracked something, and by the way, it was actually first recognized. It wasn't tooted really by the Chinese government. It was actually people in the know in Silicon Valley who were saying, "Oh, congratulations, you've actually," for example, people at OpenAI were saying, "Well, we've actually discovered some of the stuff we've done and independently." So I think DeepSeek moment was important, one, because it showed that it is possible for innovation in China to close the gap, if not reverse the gaps in every case with the US. But also the important lesson of DeepSeek, it wasn't actually an intentional thing that they discovered. I mean, again, this was a quant fund that had sort of hidden away in Hangzhou and Zhejiang precisely to get away from the eye of the regulator in Beijing or Shanghai. And they independently funded this research. Now, some people say, oh, they had other subsidies, but I don't think so. I mean, the reality was, very smart people with capital will discover things. And about half of AI engineers in the world, we're told, are Chinese. Pick a problem or pick a challenge, whether it be in tech or whether it be in medicine or biotech or environmental, half or so of the engineers involved will be Chinese. And they may be Chinese in China, or they may be Chinese in the US or increasingly now in other parts of the world, given the challenges for, Chinese PhDs and so on in the US. Within China, things have been improving. We're seeing, more investment going into companies listed in Shanghai, Shenzhen, even Beijing now has a sort of a tech board, and the role of Hong Kong is very influential. We've seen pretty positive number of IPOs this year. So financing of Chinese in China is on the up, but money coming in from the US, say the old, hedge funds, private equity money into Chinese firms has really dropped off. But there are
Well,
also Chinese outside China who are doing well in different parts of the world. Even Abu Dhabi, the leading AI company there, he's now naturalized Emirati, but he's from China. So you see examples of Chinese outside China having an impact too, including in Silicon Valley, but also increasingly Singapore. We're seeing that also in Japan. And I've met some of these people in Japan. There are Chinese who had moved to Silicon Valley, built careers there, who've decided to move because the US is feeling more constrained to them. So there are some Chinese have chosen to leave China for the reasons I described. I mean, there's regulatory restrictions or excess competition, or sometimes getting access to chips or computing power or unrestricted internet, you name it. So there are some Chinese running away or running overseas. Others are staying behind, and so that's an interesting dichotomy. Who will do better, those who leave or those who stay?
but China is also keen to play up the number of people who are coming back to China from the US. We've had AI experts coming back to Tsinghua University. We've had mathematicians. They're even having sort of foreign, like this world leading battery scientist from Italy called Stefano Passerini coming to work in Nanjing in China. Is that significant? Is that going to really boost China in all these areas, or is it not going to make much difference at this point?
No, I think it is important. I mean, China is actively recruiting the best talent globally. In fact, there's even a program for that. Is it 1,000 talents or 100 talents? I mean, and some of this list was then used by the US to say, oh, these are people that, we need to keep an eye on from fleeing and so on. But well, firstly, there's echoes of history here, right? If we think about the Chinese atomic bomb project, these were again victims of McCarthyism in some cases, who did come back to China.
Like, for example, Chen Shui-sun, who had to leave the US in the McCarthy era and basically
Right.
came back and became the sort of father of China's nuclear program. But you mentioned the fact that companies are now getting funding through IPOs, and there was a company called More Threads Technology, which is one of the
Yes, they're about to have
chip
an IPO, I think.
chip makers who are going to have an IPO in Shanghai. Is that channel now becoming easier for these companies? Is the government going out of its way to make it simple for them to raise funding in that fashion? That's the alternative to sort of local governments pouring in lots of money, which the government is perhaps keen to avoid.
So there is, I mean, the Moore's thread, as you mentioned, I mean, was a former NVIDIA China head, right? But we've seen a remarkably
Who
fast
who
growth.
set up his own company?
Yeah, so that's now, that's happening at record speed. So the other aspect, yeah, I mean, there's a long history of Chinese government. In fact, there's a long history of governments everywhere trying to pick winners. I mean, we could go back to the UK French Concorde project, which turned out to be a massive taxpayer subsidy to movie stars to be able to fly 3 hours from London to New York. In the end, it was never a commercially widely deployed product. So there is always a risk of governments creating these pet projects that are prestige projects, but are they actually doing anything? And are they independent of government funding for the future? Well, we're beginning to see that they are in some places in China. And there's a big debate, and over the electric vehicles industry here. How much was it subsidized? Is subsidized, but the reality is, it is now the default product that people want to buy. So whether the subsidies were helping in the early stages consumers to take the plunge, or in investing in infrastructure to make it more widely accessible if you're driving from A to B. The fact is, we are now seeing independently consumers opting to buy electric vehicles for superior products that they are. I mean, I was just visiting the Li Auto showroom here in Beijing in Solana Mall, and you can have this very large van. This thing can charge in 5-10 minutes and has a range of 550 kilometers, with seats that can swivel around and massive TVs and massage and all that. So I mean, EV is probably the most recognizable product that showcases the gap with legacy technology in the West. And famously, I think it's the CEO of Ford, has been driving a Xiaomi. He got a special import license for R&D and can't stop raving about it. So
Yeah,
there are products in China that are clearly ahead.
When I was in China a couple of months ago, I was very struck by the fact that the highways in Shanghai are full of these Chinese-made electric vehicles, including, as you say, the sort of Xiaomi sports car, which looks like a cross between a Porsche and an Aston Martin or something. I mean, extremely
I think
modern
it was basically a
looking.
Porsche. I think they've sort of admitted that they did sort of. In fact, Lei Jun, I think, said, right, yeah, we were quite heavily inspired by Porsche in this case. But they've also said, by the way, we don't want to do that anymore. Let's see. But, when now they have enough experience and scale and designers coming in from all over and their own designers within China, we're going to start seeing new form factors. But yeah, there's clearly been a sense of imitation here, but not on the core technology, which is, driven by companies like CATL and BYD and China's, vertical integration in the sector.
Because they are now producing most of the world's batteries for these vehicles.
Batteries and yes, exactly, sourcing the rare earths and the processing of the rare earths. So in a way, I mean, China's challenge today is almost like the smartest kid in our class, which at least for me wasn't me. They're doing too well. I mean, China's challenge is almost it's moving ahead too fast in some areas, certainly in electric vehicles.
I mean, the government, of course, summoned electric vehicle manufacturers to Beijing this summer because of this fear of what they're calling involution, the result of just massive overproduction, that the prices have gone so low. I mean, BYD cut its prices significantly earlier in the year, didn't it?
Yes, you're right. So this speaks to the idea that there's too much competition in China. That even amongst local governments, it's critical to mention that local governments themselves all want to be the home. Whether it's Guizhou for AI versus Hainan for AI or for cloud computing rather. There's just so much competition. I mean, you have a government run by engineers, including, by the way, very talented engineers who spend time in the West. So these are very worldly people, well-educated worldly people who understand technology and believe, have a faith in technology. Of course, from on high, from Xi himself, that this is the new Khrushchev. It's not exactly banging a shoe on the table to say we'll bury you, but they're saying we will certainly kick dust on you, at least with our tech, and the sense of need, to be autonomous, given the very aggressive restrictions, which predate Trump, of course. I mean, some of these go back even to Obama, but certainly through Biden as well. We've seen that China's been recognizing that they have to be more independent. But the fact is, it is also the case that inefficient allocation of capital means that we do end up with excess capacity.
I was struck by the fact that the government is also now trying to rein in the development of some of these data centers, the kind of compute power which is needed for AI and for all of this online data. Hundreds of these have sprung up, particularly after this government policy that, as you suggested, was trying to encourage them to open up in more remote regions in Western China where the power is cheaper, like I believe
Well, because of hydro. Yeah. And then,
Guizhou.
yeah, no, Guizhou particularly,
So,
and
so the
even.
government now is trying to kind of bring them all under one central umbrella, so to try and make this a bit more rational, I guess.
Well, I think the problem is that, it's smart people who figure these things out at the same time, and this includes government officials in different parts of China, but also entrepreneurs. They're like, aha, compute power is the key, hydro is key, but this is now maybe even having geopolitical implications. Building a large dam in Western China, which may affect China's neighbors to the south and west. But if you think about it, if you talk to, look at what we're hearing from NVIDIA and others, they don't talk about processing power. They talk about megawatts, basically. The power is the new measure of AI because the fusion of the chips and the power and the data together, but power is what they measure. And China not only has, lots of renewables as well as still coal and tons of nuclear, it also has a smart grid, right? Far ahead of many other places. So it can manage the distribution of this. So China, from a power standpoint, is in a very strong position, I would say.
So, I mean, you raise this question of the competition and the geopolitical tensions between China and the US. And we've seen, obviously, J.D. Vance talking about the AI arms race. We've seen Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, the huge US chip maker, shuttling backwards and forwards between China and the US and Taiwan as well. And, obviously he's caught in the middle with the US trying to restrict the export of the top end NVIDIA chips to Chinese companies. And then China sort of, as you suggest, doubling down and saying, well, OK, then we're just going to ban the import of things like this and ensure that government departments, government state-owned enterprises use Chinese chips. But he's made the point that China is not behind the US, or he's said it's nanoseconds behind the US in the area of AI. So, I mean, what do you think is going to be the upshot of this? Some people have said that the US could be making an error if it restricts the sale of too many high-tech chips because it will only boost China's industry. Other people have obviously said that they've got to ensure that China remains behind so they can't export the highest quality material. What do you feel about this?
So US China on things like certainly Nvidia, it's part of a bigger puzzle, right? So for example, just 2 weeks ago, the state SAMR in China, which looks at market sort of monopolies, dropped an antitrust move against Google in China. But at the same time, the doubling down, I think, on Nvidia, the CAC, which is the Cyberspace Administration, said that Nvidia should not no longer be able to sell its RTX Pro 6000D chip. Now, what that means is a chip that was seen as good enough for China, but not as threatening, perhaps for the US to see going to China. And Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, infamously said, well, let's get them addicted on this kind of product. And, that's fine. We'll make money in their doing. And so they've sharpened their targeting of NVIDIA in that, even if they're letting go on things like Google. But also, this is linked to TikTok as well, which we haven't mentioned yet. But the idea that the fixation of President Trump and President Trump's closest supporters in the tech world, including Larry Ellison, or now it turns out Rupert Murdoch as well, keen to get a piece of U.S. TikTok. This reveals an interesting shift. So under the Biden administration, national security was, the key driver. Under Jake Sullivan, this idea that you must have a small yard with a high fence, right? Our issue with China isn't about everything, but in areas of national defense and security, there's going to be no negotiation. This is just completely behind the fence. We will clearly delineate areas that are subject to national defense and security from other areas. Well, the reality is it's kind of hard to do that. And also under the Trump administration, too, at least, we've seen a much more mercantilist approach to say, well, we could trade away certain issues that we've had with China for example, allowing US interests to buy a majority stake of TikTok in the US. Now, I'm not saying which one is better. I mean, if anything, one could say that US-China relations might be on the verge of improving significantly if we start to see more of these trading deals.
This deal for TikTok, they're calling it a joint venture, right?
Exactly. So, and actually a friend, Kevin Xu, who writes a great tech newsletter, wrote well about this to say that, previously we had this sort of binary issue with, US China tech. Either you sell or we shut it down, like for TikTok. But now we have this middle ground, which is more like a licensing arrangement. And that may work in both ways. We might start to see a future where, I don't know, BYD or CATL could and frankly should, invest in the United States and then license its technology, which of course the irony is this is all that we experienced as Westerners in China in the 90s and 2000s. It was about the joint venture, right? So we Westerners come here, you have this market, China, we are going to graciously allow you access to our technology. Well, the shoe's on the other foot now, and the shoe's made in China, clearly. So basically, we will now have to eat a bit of humble pie. We're beginning to see this happen in Europe, in Mexico, and other places. It's complicated, but I think under Trump, we are seeing deals are being done in areas that would not have been countenanced by the Democrats before.
Looking at how advanced China's production of its own chips is becoming, there's been a lot of talk about this Huawei product, which has brought together lots and lots of chips and creating something that can compete in many ways with some of NVIDIA's top products. How significant is that? And do they have the production capacity in China to back up this kind of innovation?
Well, I think I'm not a hunter and I don't advocate hunting, but I mean, the idea is, if you're hunting a boar, you want to make sure you get them because otherwise it could gore you, right? So there's a sense that, having gone at China through a range of measures, on the one hand, they may have encouraged further investment within China, further innovation from government, but also perhaps from engineers. As you said, there might be, engineers coming back from the US who've been subject to the infamous China Project before, which was profiling Chinese as not being loyal in the United States, even if they're citizens. And now, of course, if the US is really doubling down on making, tech and keeping tech in the US, well, they're going to need a lot of help in doing that. And so by going after some of the most talented people who just by numbers are going to be foreigners, it's a big risk that the US won't be able to keep up its momentum or keep its edge. I think the way to think of it, it's, Chinese talent is a major factor in who's going to pull ahead for China, the US, and other places, actually. So who's best able to nurture that talent, keep them there, give them access to capital without suspicion, where warranted, that's going to be the name of the game. But for the US, the risk is that it's going to be handicapping itself. And the big question remains for China, can they create the secret sauce in China that has been the case in the US? If the government gets too involved or there are too many restrictions or there's too much competition, it's not a picnic in China.
In terms of AI, despite the DeepSeek moment, clearly there was a lot of discussion about what kind of answers would DeepSeek's generative AI give you if you asked it certain political questions, some relating to sensitive issues in China, clearly. So do
But
you
also, I
think?
think it's worth saying that DeepSeek itself, I think the best way to see DeepSeek is as a catalyst, right? It woke people up outside China to the fact that, well, China can actually surprise us, but also within China, that people in China said, well, it is possible actually for a small group to actually not humiliate, but certainly surprise, companies outside in a way which did engender national pride. But like many, a catalyst is often discarded at the end of a chemical process. I think it always is. So at the end of the day, companies now like Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, and others are, heavily investing themselves. Obviously, they have their own cloud infrastructure, certainly in the case of Alibaba, but also investing heavily in chips. And then alongside companies like Huawei, and I know Huawei pretty well. And of course, Huawei itself famously became a strong company by going global. Actually, it was actually kind of excluded within the Chinese market by local joint ventures that forced them out. And so actually they thrived after many decades of hard work outside China, coming back in, and they eschewed actually government support or being too closely affiliated with the government. Now they really have no choice because they're sort of the anointed one to sort of drive China's chips. You go back a decade or more, Huawei would try to not be seen as the chosen one by the Chinese government because it wouldn't help them with their global ambitions. But having seen them effectively cut off in many places, Huawei is doubling down now on being the China player in chips.
So the point you're making really is that even if there are lots of regulatory limits on what companies can do in China, that's not necessarily going to stop them from innovating in technological terms, and they may find ways to do things outside China as well.
Well, yeah, you're referring to DeepSeek and sort of access to information and so on. But I mean, for chip companies, no. I mean, I think if anything, the government is bending over backwards now to give all kinds of support to these champions. And at the same time, of course, U.S. government, including under initiatives from President Biden to bring chip manufacturing, TSMC and others, and Japanese into Arizona and so on, they also have been throwing a lot of money at it. But we've seen the results have been slower to come through. And spending time in Japan, I see a place where already, TSMC has built two large plants down in Kumamoto in southwest Japan.
TSMC
Where,
being Taiwan Semiconductor, the world's biggest chip maker.
yes, which is ultimately the
But you're saying
Taiwanese.
that it's easier for them to do that in Japan than in the US, are you?
That's proven. Yeah, they've already built at lower cost and much faster plants in Kumamoto before they've even completed in Arizona.
Just on the idea that you mentioned that 15 or 20 years ago, the big Western companies were coming into China and sort of saying, oh, we're generously going to offer you a little bit of our technological advantage and the benefit of our knowledge. Where all this rapid development that you've talked about, where is it leaving Western companies? We've seen Apple with its strategy of being massively invested in China, doing the majority of its manufacturing there. Where are they now in the Chinese market? Does the iPhone still have a big future in China when you've got Huawei and Xiaomi and all those competitors? And we're also seeing that issue with the European car makers for whom China was the holy grail, but as you mentioned, now they're facing such competition, not just in terms of other brands, but also in terms of the price cutting war that's hitting everyone's profits in China.
Yeah, well, I would make a big distinction between, say, Apple and the European car makers in the sense that Apple, even when it's had lower market share in China, has had the vast majority of profit from this market. Obviously, we have the whole Android economy, which includes many Chinese players as well as others, Koreans and so on. But the net value of that business in terms of content is much lower than the Apple economy, let's say. And of course, I refer everybody to Apple in China, which is a masterful book that goes through how Apple rose globally because of China. And one can say it's almost a Chinese company. It is highly dependent on certainly manufacturing here, but also of course, the market. But so I think Apple is a one extreme of that spectrum. The other extreme would be the European car makers who, frankly got a bit lazy over their lock on the Chinese market, which ironically was through joint ventures with state-owned enterprises that actually really satisfied no one in the end because they didn't really allow China to develop any brands of their own in the ICE, the combustion engine world. And also they created a sense of, that Western car makers could sell okay products, but not really innovate to a great degree. And so China, remember when we first came here, it was all sort of VW Santanas and so on, 30 years ago. And for the longest time, China didn't have its own
Yeah,
brands.
the classic Shanghai taxi, of course.
Yes, the Santana. And, this was an inferior product that had been sort of fobbed off on China for a long time. And obviously things did improve here. But now with the electric vehicle, revolution, effectively, that's just completely changed the game. And so we see the Chinese are much further ahead. And we see companies like Stellantis and VW increasingly looking to learn from China, to license from China, or to work with China in Europe and other places. So I'd say Apple still retains an edge in China in terms of aspiration, but it also is challenged because Apple is slow in AI, right? They're behind the game in consumer AI, and they've actually turned to Alibaba actually as a partner for AI in China, which is interesting.
So you don't see Apple significantly moving its supply chain out of China. They've tried to set up factories in India, for example, and then I believe that some of the Foxconn engineers, the company who makes the iPhones, were brought back to China by the government who didn't want to see this production happening in sort of rival countries, as it were.
Yes, well, but however, I believe most of the iPhones being supplied to the US right now are made in India. So there has been a shift of production, but we've also had, again, as we've seen with visas, we've seen the same for this third country manufacturing. We saw specifically India was targeted, saying, well, just because Apple's moving its production to India doesn't help us. We really want it to manufacture in the United States, or so the whole friendshoring, offshoring viability policy is now in question. Politics is just getting into all of our devices and all of our lives, and it's adding cost. And the number one thing I would say here is that all of these attempt to decouple, de-risk, and not commenting on the merits or demerits of those policies, but they just add cost and they add delay and complexity. And then on the other hand, consumers in many places facing squeezed budgets, certainly in Europe, and I think perhaps soon in the US, are going to be feeling the price impact of this, not to mention tariffs. So is it
Mm.
sustainable for governments to play these geopolitical games and these sometimes fantasies or sometimes rational decisions to de-risk and yet affect consumer interest? I think we may start to see a coalescence of consumer awareness of the costs of this to them.
That's really interesting. I was actually just going to ask you about, for example, in the future, to what extent do you think China will play a role in setting the standards? We saw their involvement in 4G, 5G development changing. I don't know how you think how much part China will play in future standards for phone technology, for example, but also you spend quite a lot of time in France as well. And we saw
Yeah.
President Macron this year hosting a big AI conference at which he talked a lot about the need for regulation and for sort of European and Western values to be implanted into AI. That was, in a sense, an attempt to push back against, I guess, both China and the US. How much do you see China playing a role in these sort of future standards?
Oh, already they've been, working on this for a long time. I mean, one can say at one point that China, through companies like Huawei and ZTE or Zhongxing before, were actually trying to play the global game, and they were getting involved in international standards. They had big markets outside. They still do in the global south, but much less so in the west, say. They've, in a sense, been forced to look at more assertive ways of pushing their own technologies or their own standards. Now, of course, this also includes the way we think about content and restricted content. I mean, famously, the Safe Cities program to export surveillance technology and so on to, and I've seen this in places like Lima, the traffic system there, or in Djibouti, for example, facial recognition technology for people who want to trace down,
This
offenders.
is coming from Huawei, for example.
Well, Huawei also, you've seen a raft of measures imposed from the US going after companies that are exporting technologies which are seen to be involved in surveillance in ways that they don't like, potentially military applications. But also we've just seen, frankly, that some of this is driven by cost. That, if you look at the number of phones made in Africa, or exported to Africa coming from China, I mean, it's the essential supplier of consumer tech to the global south, to Turkey, to Brazil, and so on. So again, this comes back to that consumers will want access to the cheapest product possible of quality. And if China is able to do that, and we see US or slash Western companies a bit asleep at the switch on that, then yeah, nature abhors a vacuum. So we're going to see China filling these places. We also see restrictions put up, as we saw in places like India and elsewhere, where there's a sense of security vulnerabilities. So it's not universal that China is going to dominate in these markets and also standards bodies. But China is also within the UN. China has done a lot in exerting its influence within the official, not only the UN, but global standards bodies. And then more importantly, I think it's going to come from the fact that it just has a large domestic market and large vendors that are exporting that gives them a say in shaping future technologies or let's say robotics or even hosting conferences in Shanghai over AI standards, etc. They're having a concerted push to exert their influence on governance, which is part of Xi Jinping's own push, right? That China is going to be increasingly shaping global governance.
And how much do you think all of this technology is going to boost the Chinese economy? You mentioned the fact that at a sort of grassroots level, there's still a lot of people struggling to get jobs. I think I've seen a figure that electric vehicles, EVs, and batteries and solar power contributed something like 10% of China's GDP last year. And obviously it's seen that that will grow rapidly in the future as well. But do you think that the sort of technological revolution can ultimately play a significant role in reviving the economy?
Parts of it, yes. There are different estimates of, how big the impact of AI can be on any economy, right, including in China. But there's certainly one can see it even from a geographic level. One can go to Shenzhen and Hangzhou and actually see certainly Shenzhen from the hardware side of things, but also Hangzhou more from the software side of it. We mentioned DeepSeek. You can feel the prosperity there pouring in right now. New ventures are being set up. But you wouldn't have to drive too far away to feel the depopulating countryside in China, where there are fewer opportunities. But that's becoming probably a global question. I mean, Jensen Huang, when he was in the UK, I think last week from NVIDIA, was talking about you have to make sure that your job involves tasks that are still relevant. There are many tasks that will go away. I mean, I was just looking at a robot, this one out of Taiwan, that it's like folding sheets for hotels. I think, well, so information becomes very key. Like how can you be aware that your job is secure or not, and what do you do about it? Do you have the means to retool or to relearn skills? And China, to some extent, is one interesting phenomenon. You're seeing if you go on YouTube now, you start to see, or TikTok, you see younger bloggers from the West coming to China, for example, strapping on a thing you can rent at a mountain in China and walk up the mountain without effort. I mean, it's like a robotic sort of exoskeleton, which only costs maybe $900, but you can rent it for, I don't know, 50 kwai or something for, $8 or something, and you walk up a mountain without any effort, And so we're seeing people saying, oh my God, I've seen the future here in China. So the same, a lot of the same issues are happening, around the world, but it's just framed differently, I would say. But I would say the original point that there's generally a embrace of technology more than in the West. People, even if they're starting a new venture, which may not work, there will be a sense of, oh, we've got to give it a try. There's a sort of an ambition there, embracing new technology. Maybe it's live streaming. I mean, I was just in Tiananmen, near Tiananmen Square. That area, there are bloggers, vloggers selling things, live streaming, products or their services as a tour guide or, I mean, people are hustling. The China hustle hasn't ended, and they're embracing technology in a new way. And I think that rather than a sense of relying on government to help them, that there is very little sense of that in China. And we saw that, post COVID, zero COVID, that people thought, well, you've really got to take care of yourself. But that also creates a challenge for the government that people tend to save too much, right? For precarious, savings, basically mattress money for healthcare, for education. But there has been a reluctance, it seems, from the government to address the consumer side of the equation. It's more focused on production. And, again, these are engineers. These are engineers that understand factories and land and new technologies, but maybe not as much the psychology of consumers or the sense of being a bit lost. That's something that's hard to just fix with propaganda.
Well, Duncan Clark, thank you so much for talking to us on China in Context.
Thank you, Duncan.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find more information about SOAS China Institute events and read our blog on the SOAS website, soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.